On August 9, 1965, Lee Kuan Yew sat in front of television cameras, his voice cracked, and he openly cried. He wasn't crying over a lost war or a political scandal. He was crying because his country, Singapore, had just been voted out of the Federation of Malaysia. They were expelled. It was an eviction. And in the middle of the Cold War, a tiny island with no natural resources, fractured by racial riots, and surrounded by much larger, somewhat hostile neighbors, was suddenly forced to survive on its own. At that exact moment, most global analysts looked at the situation and concluded that Singapore would not last a decade. Fast forward to today, and that same island is one of the wealthiest places on the planet. Its citizens enjoy incredibly high living standards, its streets are famously safe, and its economy is a global powerhouse. So, how did they actually do it? We often hear stories that it was magic or that one man did it all by himself. But the reality is much more calculated, a lot more systematic, and honestly, full of incredibly tough trade-offs. Hi, I'm Daniel, and welcome back to Asian Money Map. On this channel, we look at the real underlying mechanics of how economies in Asia are built, without the hype and without the fluff. We are just trying to understand the facts and the systems. If that sounds like your kind of thing, stick around. To really understand Singapore's economic transformation, we have to start by correcting a very common historical myth. You've probably heard the dramatic narrative that in 1965, Singapore was nothing but a mosquito-infested swamp filled with poor fishing villages. That is actually not true. It's a great story for nation building, but factually, it's incorrect. By 1965, Singapore was already a major British military base and a highly active commercial port. It had roads, it had a bustling downtown, and it had existing infrastructure. However, just because it wasn't a swamp doesn't mean it wasn't in deep trouble. The problems they faced were structural and terrifying. Unemployment was sitting at around 14%. A massive portion of the population was living in squatter settlements with terrible sanitation. And the economy was heavily dependent on a trade model that was suddenly cut off when they separated from Malaysia. To make matters worse, a few years after independence, the British government announced they were pulling their military bases out of Singapore much earlier than expected. At that time, the British military accounted for roughly 20% of Singapore's entire gross domestic product. It provided tens of thousands of jobs. Losing that was like having the rug pulled out from under an already fragile economy. This is where the pragmatic, survivalist mindset of Singapore's early leadership really kicked in. And while Lee Kuan Yew gets the lion's share of the credit, it's important to note that he didn't do this alone. He had a brilliant team, including his finance minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and a crucial advisor from the United Nations named Dr. Albert Winsemius. They looked at the situation objectively and realized that the standard economic playbook of the 1960s was not going to work for them. Back then, many newly independent countries were highly nationalistic. They were kicking out foreign companies, trying to produce everything domestically and relying on foreign aid. Singapore simply didn't have the domestic market size or the natural resources to do that. If they were going to survive, they had to do the exact opposite of what everyone else was doing. They had to plug directly into the global economy and convince multinational corporations from America, Europe, and Japan to set up factories on their island. But why would a foreign company invest in a volatile region with no proven track record? The answer was creating an environment of extreme predictability and efficiency. Capital hates uncertainty. So, the Singaporean government set out to build an industrial oasis. They took a massive swampy area called Jurong, which really was a swamp at the time, and started bulldozing hills and filling in land to create a massive industrial estate. It was incredibly risky. Critics locally called it Goh's folly, thinking it was a massive waste of money because, initially, it sat completely empty. To fill it, the government went on an aggressive marketing campaign globally. They promised foreign investors tax holidays, cheap land, and most importantly, a disciplined strike-free workforce. The government actively suppressed labor unions and strikes to ensure that when a foreign factory opened, production would never be interrupted. It was a harsh policy for the workers at the time, but the goal was job creation at all costs. Slowly, companies like Texas Instruments and Hewlett-Packard started to arrive. realizing that Singapore was offering a level of stability and infrastructural support that they couldn't find anywhere else in the developing world at that time. Now, building infrastructure like the Jurong industrial estate, paving roads, and building ports requires a massive amount of capital. Where did a poor, newly independent government get all that money without burying itself in international debt? This leads us to one of the most brilliant, yet heavily debated economic mechanisms in Singapore's history, the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. Now, to be factually accurate, the British colonial government actually started the CPF in 1955, before Lee Kuan Yew took full power. However, it was Lee's government that took this existing institution and expanded it into an absolute powerhouse of national development. The CPF is essentially a mandatory forced savings scheme. A significant percentage of every worker's monthly salary is automatically deducted and put into this state-managed fund, and the employer also has to contribute a percentage. In the early days, these contribution rates were pushed incredibly high. For the individual, this meant they had very little disposable income. But for the government, it meant they suddenly had access to a massive pool of domestic capital. Instead of borrowing from the World Bank or foreign governments, Singapore borrowed from its own citizens at relatively low interest rates. They used the billions of dollars pooling in the CPF to fund the rapid construction of highways, ports, telecommunications, and most importantly, housing. Housing is perhaps the most critical pillar of Singapore's social and economic stability. In the early 1960s, the living conditions were grim. Overcrowded slums were prone to massive fires and disease. But the slums were also hotbeds for racial tension. Singapore is a multiracial society, primarily Chinese, Malay, and Indian. In the early days, these communities often lived in segregated areas, leading to deep distrust and violent, sometimes deadly racial riots. The government realized that you cannot build a prosperous economy if your workforce is constantly fighting each other. So, through the Housing and Development Board, or HDB, they began an aggressive campaign of building high-rise public housing. Today, nearly 80% of the population lives in these HDB flats. But the physical buildings were only half the strategy. The real masterstroke was how they populated them. The government implemented strict laws allowing them to acquire land cheaply, bulldoze the slums, and move the population into these new apartments. But to prevent the formation of new racial enclaves, they introduced the Ethnic Integration Policy in 1989. This policy mandated that every single HDB block and neighborhood had to reflect the national demographic breakdown. There were strict quotas. If you wanted to buy a flat in a certain building, but the quota for your specific race was already filled, you simply could not buy it. You were legally forced to live in a building where you would be mixed with families of other races. As an analyst, looking at this policy, it is a fascinating and extreme form of social engineering. From a Western democratic perspective, telling someone they cannot buy a house because of their race seems like a massive violation of personal liberty. But from the Singaporean government's perspective, it was a necessary tool for national survival. By forcing people to share elevators, corridors, and local markets, they practically engineered racial harmony. You can't riot against your neighbor when your kids play in the same playground. It created a baseline of social stability that allowed everyone to focus purely on making a living. And interestingly, they allowed citizens to use their forced CPF savings to pay for these government-built flats, turning a population of squatters into a population of homeowners who now had a literal, physical stake in the country's success. As the manufacturing sector boomed and people moved into stable housing, the government had to address another massive hurdle: corruption. In many parts of the world, and certainly in parts of Asia during the 1960s and 70s, corruption was just a standard cost of doing business. But Lee Kuan Yew understood that if foreign investors felt they had to pay bribes to get things done, they would take their money elsewhere. To fight this, he utilized the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPIB, again, just for historical accuracy. This bureau was actually established by the British in 1952, but it was largely toothless. When Lee Kuan Yew came into power, he gave the CPIB immense, almost terrifying authority. They were given the power to investigate anyone, access any bank account, and even arrest people on suspicion alone. And the government made sure to lead by example. There were no exceptions. not even for the political elite. When Tay Chiang-wan, the Minister for National Development and a close political ally of Lee, was investigated for accepting bribes in 1986, the system did not protect him. The investigation was relentless, and tragically, the minister chose to take his own life rather than face the charges. The message this sent to the public, and more importantly to the international business community, was that the rule of law in Singapore was absolute. But punishing people is only one side of the coin. If you want a clean system, you also have to remove the financial incentive to be corrupt. This led to a policy that is still hotly debated today: paying government ministers and top civil servants salaries that compete with the private sector. The logic is straightforward. If you want the smartest, most capable minds managing your country's economy, you are competing with investment banks and multinational corporations for that talent. If you pay a minister a fraction of what they could make in the private sector, you might only attract mediocre talent, or worse, talent that is easily tempted by bribes. Today, a minister in Singapore can make over $1 million a year. It's an expensive payroll, but the argument is that a highly paid, competent, and clean government is far cheaper in the long run than a poorly paid, corrupt one that mismanages the economy. As Singapore moved through the 1980s and 90s, they realized they couldn't rely on cheap manufacturing forever. So, the government actively steered the economy towards higher-value industries. They invested heavily in education, making English the working language to ensure their workforce could communicate globally, while keeping mother tongues to retain cultural identity. They built up their financial sector, establishing robust legal frameworks that turned them into a major global banking hub. They optimized the port of Singapore, leaning into their one natural advantage: their geographic location along the Strait of Malacca, making it one of the busiest and most efficient transshipment ports in the world. Everything was meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. But this is where we need to step back and analyze the model objectively. Singapore's success is undeniable, but it did not come for free. The model they built is often described as a nanny state. The government has its hand in almost every aspect of a citizen's life, from where they can live to how much they must save to what they can read or watch. Throughout its development, political opposition was heavily marginalized. Laws like the Internal Security Act allowed for detention without trial, which was used in the early days against political opponents and suspected communists. The press has traditionally been heavily regulated, and freedom of speech has clear boundaries, especially regarding topics that could incite racial or religious tension. The social contract that the ruling People's Action Party offered to the citizens was incredibly clear, even if unspoken. Give us the mandate to rule without the messy gridlock of Western-style liberal democracy, accept our strict rules and social boundaries. And in return, we will guarantee your physical safety, provide you with housing, build world-class infrastructure, and make you wealthier than you could ever imagine. For the vast majority of the population over the last few decades, that trade-off was absolutely worth it. When you look at the leap in living standards from a chaotic, struggling island in 1965 to a futuristic, highly advanced metropolis today, it's hard to argue with the results on a purely economic spreadsheet. However, my opinion is that this model is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to simply copy and paste to another country. Singapore's success is the result of a very specific set of circumstances. It's a city-state, which means the government doesn't have to balance the needs of rural farmers against urban bankers. It was built during a specific window of the Cold War when global supply chains were just starting to expand. And crucially, it relied on a core group of founding leaders who wielded immense, almost unchecked power, but genuinely chose to use that power to build the nation rather than line their own pockets. If you apply this exact same system in a country where the leadership is self-serving, you don't get an economic miracle, you just get an efficient dictatorship. Singapore is an ongoing, fascinating case study in optimization. It proves that with enough discipline, strategic planning, and a willingness to make unpopular decisions, even a country with zero natural resources can build an economic fortress. But it also forces us to ask deep questions about what a society values most. So I'll leave you with a question to think about, and I genuinely want to hear your honest thoughts on this. If you were guaranteed absolute physical safety, incredible public services, a spotless environment, and tremendous economic opportunity, Would you be willing to give up a portion of your political expression, accept a highly regulated media, and live under very strict social laws? Where is your personal line between liberty and prosperity? Let me know in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can because understanding how different people view these trade-offs is exactly what this channel is about. And if you found this analysis helpful and want to keep exploring the systems and realities behind money and power in Asia without the usual cheerleading, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know to keep making content like this. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.